Thank you very much for the organization. And, oops, I lost the cable. Okay, we'll fix that. It worked, so it should work again. Did it come back? It's coming back. It's coming back. Okay. It's okay. So, you saw my title, Most People React. That'll be a very short talk, right? Well, here's the outline. I give you the answer to the title question first, and the answer to the title question is, what is uncontroversial about Kuhn? Kuhn produced more confusion than any other 20th century philosopher of science or historian of science. Okay, the questions perhaps shamefully posed by some is now in your mind, look at your neighbor or at yourself, was Kuhn really a philosopher of science? That's the philosopher's question, and the other one is, was Kuhn really a historian of science? And the confusion begins to emerge. Here we are. All right, quite some confusion exists about many topics that Kuhn brought up, and I'm just mentioning a few of them here. The context of discovery versus context of justification. People put down the book when they read that, what Kuhn wrote about, the context distinction, about paradigms, of course, and scientific progress, relativism, subjectivism, irrationality, and it was also mentioned already, internalism versus externalism in historiography, etc. Well, in this talk, I shall only treat one topic of that sort, and that's difficult enough. Can you guess it? Incommensurability. All right. Now, there are many different sources for the confusion about incommensurability, and again, I shall treat only four of them, interesting ones. One is Paul Feyerabend, the second one is incomparability, the third is self-refutation, and the fourth is world change. We heard it already in talks today. So, let's start with the first source of confusion, Paul Feyerabend. Well, the reason is that Paul Feyerabend also introduced the concept of incommensurability in 1962, slightly but not insignificantly different from Kuhn's. I heard it today in a conversation that people at Princeton, was it, or Berkeley created the Kuhn-Feyerabend figure, as one figure, they identified the two. At the time, it was not obvious, apparently, that the two different notions of incommensurability were in play there, but they were, if you look at the details. I shall not follow up these differences here, but I give you here a piece of mine, three biography, Kuhn, Feyerabend, and incommensurability. I note here, because my name is so difficult both to pronounce and to write, I'm using the Stanford notation of my name. That was invented by then graduate student Hasok Chang in the early 90s. He just said, we talk about HH, that's easier. Okay. There is proof, by the way, that Kuhn and Feyerabend did not talk very much about incommensurability, and here it is. You see them here, they sit next to each other, they look there, it's probably incommensurability, but they don't talk about it, and I'm waiting and watching, but they don't talk about it. Okay. Now to the next topic, which is also a sort of comedy, it's about incomparability. Well, incommensurability always, in all its uses, always means some sort of incomparability. And the common thesis that people derive from that is if paradigms or theories are incommensurable, theory choice cannot be rational because it cannot be based on a comparative evaluation. I even heard that today in some talks. That's the common thesis. However, one has to be very careful because now here I highlighted incommensurability means some sort of incomparability. It's not just, and it certainly not means absolute incomparability, because such a thing doesn't exist. You can always compare two things with each other. There's certainly always an aspect, its mode of being, or its length, or its weight, or its color, whatever it is. You can always compare two things. So absolute incommensurability doesn't exist. So what is Kuhn talking about? Well, and in general, one can say that incommensurability means incomparability with respect to some standard procedure that usually works. And therefore, the rhetorician Randy Harris, he said, it's a very nice phrase, incommensurability is a special category of failure, a failure of some standard procedures. And that is really the connotation of incommensurability one has to take very seriously. For Kuhn, incommensurability means that the standard procedure of rational theory comparison does not work, and the standard procedure being the comparison of the respective lists of solved problems. It's more than that. It's not just this comparison of lists of solved problems. Why is that the case? Well, there are again some sources. Not exactly the same set of problems is relevant for both theories. Not exactly the same set of concepts is relevant in both theories. And not exactly the same set of values is relevant for both theories. So one shouldn't be surprised that the standard procedure doesn't really work. So, thus, the consequence is that Kuhn only rejected one specific kind of rational theory comparison, not rational theory comparison altogether. And many people believe that Kuhn rejected rational theory comparison altogether, which is just wrong. Incommensurability does not imply incomparability, and therefore does not imply the irrationality of scientific development. Unfortunately, many people still believe that. If you look at the recent very good Kuhn literature, you find it that all the experts agree on this point. There are disagreements among the experts, I'm coming to them, but here is really agreement among the experts. Now here's a very nice one. The third source of confusion about Kuhn's incommensurability, it's self-refutation. And some philosophers thought that incommensurability is really self-refuting. Now here's an example, Hilary Putnam in Reason, Truth and History from 1981. The thesis of incommensurability is a self-refuting thesis to tell us that Galileo had incommensurable notions and then to go on to describe them at length is totally incoherent. Now, putative reaction by historians, yes, we've always thought it's very difficult to talk to philosophers. Okay, there is a very simple solution to the puzzle, I mean now in terms that the philosophers will hopefully understand it. Of course you can use today's English as a meta language in order to explain the incommensurable differences between today's English and Galileo's Italian. For the philosophers, Galileo wrote in Italian. So you have to distinguish that, right? And in a meta-language, of course, you can explain the differences. It's very easy then, and there's no self-refutation whatsoever. This is why Kuhn insisted that historians of science are often involved in some language teaching, because in order to understand what Galileo says, you have to understand his language, and therefore you have to be taught how his language works. So this is also a nice source of confusion. And now I come to the biggest one, the fattest one, world change. And in structure, you probably remember that. Otherwise, please read it in the latest editions, not page 150. The third and most important aspect of incommensurability is world change. Now, there have been several reactions to this claim, and I group them in three. The first one is a dismissal because of idealism. Right? You just dismiss that claim. That doesn't make sense. The second one is a diffusing of world change by a metaphorical or psychological reading. And the third one is a so-called neo-Kantian reading, and I want to treat these three strategies in turn. Now, Israel Scheffler, for instance, with reaction and dismissal in Science and Subjectivity, the first really devastating reaction in book form on Kuhn's structure, it reads the following: I cannot myself believe that this bleak picture representing an extravagant idealism is true. So he just can't believe it, I can't believe it, okay? The full argument, and I'm a philosopher, so I reconstruct such a thing as a full argument. It contains four premises and one conclusion, and this is, of course, for my fellow philosophers, but the historians will also enjoy it, I hope. So it's four premises. The first premise is incommensurability encompasses world change, of course. The second is world change in revolutions, of course not in other forms of world change, implies idealism. And before I bring up the third premise, I must warn the historians, because there is a word in it that you may find rude, right? But it's a technical term in philosophy. There's even a book on that. Now, the third premise is idealism is bullshit. Bullshit is a technical term in philosophy. And the fourth one is then bullshit can be dismissed, from which you get the conclusion. I think it's not very, I had it formalized at home, but I don't formalize it here. A conclusion, incommensurability can be dismissed. It's a very straightforward argument. okay? Now, if you want to, it's not enough that the argument is correct, but you want to, of course, also discuss the soundness of the argument, in other words, the truth of the premises. Now, at premise P2, world change implies idealism. Yes, perhaps, but the question is what sort of idealism, okay? And premise P3, the high school version of idealism is certainly very questionable. Very questionable is the academic translation then of bullshit, okay? What reality is depends on how you think of it, period. That's the high school version, okay? And then the question, of course, is, was this Kuhn's view on idealism here? Let's see. Now, the second reaction to the world change talk is a metaphorical or psychological reading and therefore diffusing of world change. And the most recent example is Alexander Bird in the British Journal. The article appeared electronically 2 weeks ago, and only today in the morning I got the pages here, the page numbers, so it's really the very same day, the paper I'm referring to. The most recent example is the following, and it's my emphasis. And I read here the quote, "In summary, a change in paradigm can bring with it a range of important psychological changes that have cognitive and emotional consequences. It is these psychological changes that Kuhn is referring to with a metaphor of world change." By the way, there is another author, also Brad Ray, who'd written 4 weeks ago also about this metaphor, but I thought this isn't recent enough. I mean, philosophers don't read these old papers, 4 weeks old. Okay, so this is the first quote here, and the other quote is very simple. It's the same message. World change focuses on the psychological consequences of a scientific revolution. Now, the question is whether Alexander Bird is right here. And now I'm behaving more like a historian, and if you have to decide a historical question or some question, you go back to the sources, and unpublished sources are, of course, the standard things for historians. Now, I go to Kuhn in the unpublished Thalheimer lecture, Scientific Development and Lexical Change, November 1984 in Baltimore. I may add here, because Alexander Bird has repeatedly said and written that I exerted a very bad influence on Kuhn. And that can't have been by that time in 84, because I met Kuhn only in August of 84, so I can't have exerted that bad influences at that time already. So it's still original Kuhn and not the badly distorted Kuhn. Anyway, here is the quote. "When I first used the locution that world changes with a lexicon more than 20 years ago," so if you calculate, that was then structure, "I thought my remark metaphorical and the metaphor eliminable. Now I'm not so sure." Wait a minute, he's not so sure about what? About the eliminability, or that the remark is metaphorical? So you don't really know what he's saying. You say, okay, yeah, we know that, Kuhn. I mean, we don't understand what he's saying. Well, here are other quotes. "I shall then suggest that the reiterated assertion that the world changes with the structure of the lexicon used to describe it ought not to be heard simply as metaphor." So that's very clear. It ought not simply be heard as metaphor. And there are other things even more clearly. "I see no alternative to taking literally my repeated locution that the world changes with the lexicon." That's clear enough. Here's another one, a follow-up. Is this an idealist position? Perhaps it is. But the idealism is then unlike any other of which I am aware. So the result of that is that the metaphorical psychological reading of world change does not capture Kuhn's intentions. That doesn't say that the intentions are not self-contradictory or whatever, but it certainly doesn't capture Kuhn's intentions. And therefore, here's another way of how to react to the world change locutions, the so-called neo-Kantian. And again, I go back to the sources from 1979 onward. Kuhn described his position as Kantian with temporarily mutable categories. Or in Peter Lipton's nice words, Kuhn's position is Kant on wheels. Now let me make one remark first, that this cannot be entirely correct. And this has the following reason. If you look at Kant, really what he does in his critical philosophy, Kant's forms of intuition and forms of thought, the categories, are responsible for the constitution of what physical things are in general, of spatio-temporal things, And Kant's form of intuitions, in other words, and thought, are constitutive of thinghood. That is what the Kantian theory is all about. Whereas, by contrast, Kuhn's world change does usually not affect thinghood itself. It only affects the existence, the qualities, and the relations of specific things, but their thinghood remains the same. So it's not really exactly the same, but that hasn't been noted in the literature, and I've noted it only very lately, very recently, I must admit. At any rate, but this is not so important because Kuhn's spirit is the same as Kant's. And now let's look at that a little. And that spirit is the following, and that may somehow, some of you may be a little bit confused about that. What we correctly take as objective reality is nevertheless somehow shaped by genetically subject-sided components. Genetically, not in the sense of biology, but that's origin on the subject side, as I call that. So what we correctly take as objective reality is nevertheless somehow shaped by genetically subject-sided components. That's the message of Kant, and that's the message of Kuhn. Now, does this make sense? I mean, you may say, no, that's self-contradictory. That doesn't make sense. It's completely inconsistent. Okay. Perhaps it is. Here's an analogy. I'm leading you now in small steps to a possible understanding what that might mean. Here's the analogy. It's colors. Suppose colors as phenomenal qualities are secondary qualities. I know there's disagreement about colors, but the majority of people agree to that. They're an amalgam of genetically object-sided and genetically subject-sided components. That's the standard view. It's secondary quality, something comes from outside, and the brain or the mind produces then phenomenal colors out of that. Are colors real, is the next question. Well, yes, very much so if you want to buy a blue sweater or a red car. Imagine you ask your husband, please, darling, buy me a blue sweater, and he comes back with a green one. All right. And then he says, and you say, well, that's a green one, I asked for a blue one. Well, colors aren't real anyway. So. No, and a red car as well. So they are very much so, but not only in these everyday affairs. If you want to find out the colors of dinosaurs, for instance, and there were several papers in 2010 on the question, and they appeared in Nature and in Science, right? There are very important papers about the colors of dinosaurs, scientific things, and you can go further. Whenever you discuss the laws and regularities of colors, I mean, you take them as real. Look at the journal Color Research and Application. You find it there. I mean, they're taken as real. Okay, are colors real? Well, not really real if you focus on the purely object-sided component of colors, light of certain wavelength, reflected. Then you say, oh, the colors aren't really real. I mean, no, okay. Colors are only secondary qualities, less real than primary qualities. That's how we react to this secondary and primary qualities distinction. Now imagine the following, and that is a little difficult. Imagine that all observable and theoretical properties of things were secondary qualities as robust as colors, but without any access to the purely object-sided components, that means the corresponding primary qualities. Imagine that situation. We would probably take them as simply real, these properties, as really real. That would be our reaction, I guess. And this is the position that Kuhn had somehow in mind already in 1962. If you read the following sentence that you probably have never really understood, I haven't had my difficulties. Insofar as the scientists' only recourse to the world of their research engagement is through what they see and do, we may want to say that after a revolution, scientists are responding to a different world. That's the statement here. And what you see here is the only recourse to the world is through what they see and do. That means then, in this interpretation, the secondary qualities. And if that is the only recourse, then you take them for real. As probably in antiquity, when the distinction between secondary and primary qualities was there, but probably not applied to colors as far as I know, they took them as real. Of course, what else? As far as I can see, this position is indistinguishable from the position of perspectival realism or scientific perspectivism as developed by Ron Beery and also Paul Teller, and over the last 15 years or so, I discussed that with both of them, and I think now their position there is all humanly accessible reality is reality under a certain perspective. That's the main message of that sort of realism. And Geary used color vision as a prototype for scientific perspectivism, as I did first independently for the pertinent kind of neo-Kantianism. And this suggests the convergence of both positions. And I will probably switch labels and talk in the future about Kuhn's perspectival realism instead of neo-Kantianism. Why? This is probably more palatable in some parts of the world, including the United States. Okay, to conclude, let me mention that also during Kuhn's lifetime I've tried to resolve some of the confusions about his work, not only now, but also during his lifetime, and I've proof for that I try to show Kuhn the exact escape from many of the confusions, and it's here. Thank you very much.